Welcome to Seek Justice, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the nuances of criminal justice.
Good morning, Dennis.
Good morning, Eric. How are you?
Good. So, in this project, I would like to learn about criminal justice from you. Let's start off with definitions. What is criminal justice? What does it mean?
Well, taking it back to its basic tenet, justice is about making things right again.
Okay.
So, in a biblical sense, that meant trying to right the wrong, punish the person, and as time developed, we ended up creating 4 different types of things that we want to get out of the justice system. We want to deter individuals from committing crime by treating them a certain way, punishing them generally. Mm-hmm. We want to use them as an example so other people won't do a general deterrence.
Right.
We want to make things right for the victim, be that restoration or including restitution, mm-hmm. meaning they get their goods back, their money back. And we want to do that kind of in a fair and just way. And then it's been politicized. I'll tell you one other thing about the definition and then stop for a moment, which is that it's really a misnomer that there's a criminal justice system per se.
Okay.
Really what there is a bunch of small justice agencies that have a part in the criminal justice process.
Okay.
And if they bump up against each other, like police and the jails, meaning law enforcement system connects to the jail system because when they arrest people, they got to lock them up somewhere, and then the court takes over, and
right.
the police have something to say about that, and they testify, et cetera. So those 2 parts of the so-called justice system are coordinating at least some of their work. But then when you move up the justice system continuum beyond the courts and move into probation and parole and prisons, law enforcement has a lot less to do with that because they're not engaged in the operational aspects of that work, although there's some exceptions. But in order for it to be a true system, somebody would have to be in charge. There'd have to be a fairly well-recognized set of protocols or rules across the system, and that just isn't there. And so we call it a justice system, but really what we mean is a justice process. Mm-hmm. That tie a bunch of smaller systems together. So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. So to recap, the things that we want out of criminal justice is some punishment for general deterrence and helping the victim, and we do that through this collection of systems that are our mechanism of trying to achieve justice.
Right, including, though, the specific individual deterrence, meaning I want to convince you not to do this again. And by the way, when I do that, others see that, and then that becomes general deterrence.
Right.
And so the system, is built really, in one sense, to try to reduce crime. We don't want people to do wrongs to others, and so we try a bunch of different things to do that. But
it's both to achieve justice, but also to reduce crime.
Yeah, future crime.
Right.
Yeah, by individuals or by the general population. But we don't do that very well. And the numbers kind of tell the story. I mean, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. We can certainly get them and post them, but you've only got a certain relatively small number of crimes that are solved in the first place. Mm-hmm. So when they are solved and a perpetrator is captured, you already have a small percentage of the people that are causing the problem. And of course, the smarter the criminal, the less likely it is to catch the person. And so we end up catching a lot of people that may not be the sharpest knife in the drawer.
Right.
And probably to a much larger extent, I know this is true, we capture those that have a higher degree of substance abuse, mental illness, again, not perhaps the smartest people in the world, whereas the people that are a little bit more planful, more sophisticated, think things through, they're not just reacting to a situation and, I want to steal that, so I steal it, mm-hmm. but they plan things. Those are the folks that, tend not to get caught. If you figured in your own, knowing yourself, if you set forth to steal something and you kind of planned it out, you'd probably have a lot less likelihood of being caught than somebody who didn't take that approach, who wasn't as intelligent as you.
Right.
And and I'm painting this with a broad brush, but you get the general idea. But to take the
it's just
point,
a generalization. You're not saying that all convicts are idiots.
That's right. Right. I mean, the guy who, robs a bank and signs the note to the banker. I mean, you've heard these stories,
Right.
Whatever. But they make the news because they're exceptions. But then when you do capture this group, then there's only a certain percentage of them that are convicted, and you can check in any jurisdiction what the conviction rate is. And then of those that are convicted, only a small percentage of them are sentenced to prison or jail. So the judge has a choice to put them on their own recognizance and fine them, put them in jail, which is a local lockup for a short period of time, put them on probation, which is a supervision system prior to any imprisonment, put them in a longer-term prison situation, et cetera. And when you look at the numbers, the majority of persons do not go to prison, and you could check that by looking at a jurisdiction's imprisonment rate. And so then you end up with, maybe all things considered, and don't quote me too tightly on these numbers, maybe out of every 100 crimes, there's only one person who ends up going to prison for it. So while you may be able to have a specific deterrence on that individual, certainly while that individual is locked up, he's not going to be committing crimes in society, although he very well might be committing crimes behind bars. That's only one person out of 100 crimes committed, and people who are breaking the law know these facts. So the idea of general deterrence is also affected just by the sheer numbers of it. And so the correlation between imprisonment in a state prison system and crime reduction is very difficult to prove. There's a debate about this, and there's evidence on both sides of it, that researchers will use to prove their particular point. But you could see why it would be a stretch to think that, imprisonment in the state prison system here has much impact at all on the overall crime rate. So there are a lot of misnomers about the system, a lot of myths, and we spend, general 60, 70% of all our tax money in the states is spent on justice issues, whether it's police or courts or whatever. Prisons are very expensive, et cetera. And so politicians who want to get elected talk about the justice system, and they want to be tough on crime. And that then puts them in a position to want to spend more money on doing the things we already do, which again don't have much of a correlation, right? And there's a lot of known things you can do to actually reduce crime that are longer term that don't fit in a soundbite.
Right. So so give me an example of something that does work better than locking someone up.
Well, so when you look at, long-term data, you see correlations between adult criminal activity and the way that children are brought up and their environment. People are not born, for the most part, with criminogenic tendencies, meaning characteristics that drive them or propel them to committing crime. They learn those behaviors. And some would say that with, sociopaths or psychopaths that who end up committing crime, there is, kind of genetic basis for some of those things. But for the general approach, it's stuff that you learn. So it's not surprising that if you're in a economically deprived family environment, you've only got one parent, perhaps the father isn't part of the household, you don't have access to services and education at a young age, et cetera, then you're already in a trajectory that will lead you to perhaps poor school attendance and poor educational development. That in turn could lead to less time in schools and an education that isn't as productive. That in turn could lead to school failure, which in turn can lead to juvenile delinquency. And so thinking of all that, it's not surprising that some data shows that you want to reduce crime, help single mothers with health care for their children. And, improve the educational system for those people that because of their statistical characteristics, have got a propensity to end up as adults in the justice system. The point here is that some justice systems who are trying to predict the number of prison beds that they need in the future will use educational attainment scores for third and fourth graders to help them project far in advance.
Wow,
So,
and that's strongly correlated.
Yeah, yeah. And so, but the problem is that, politicians, if you're in a state House of Representatives, you're only elected for 2 years at a time. You literally have to start running for re-election and raising money for re-election the first day you're seated. That cycle of election is 2 years. If you're in the Senate, most states it's 4 years. Governors are 4 years, 2 terms generally. These types of long-term solutions that can show impact over time aren't all that interesting to politicians.
Right.
They're more interesting to statesmen or statespeople,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
be a little bit more PC about it. But they're not going to see the results of that. So it's much easier for them to say, well, I'm going to be tough. I've worked with political leaders here in Michigan. Former Governor Jennifer Granholm, I worked on her campaign, and she was a very early proponent and may have been the earliest politician that used the phrase, I want to be tough on crime, but I want to be smart on crime.
Nice.
Meaning you use what the research tells you and the evidence about how you need to assess the likelihood of future criminality and danger and risk, and use that to drive the level of resource that you apply in the justice system to somebody. So you don't take short-term, relatively less risky, less harmful individuals and treat them the same in the justice system as you treat people that are guilty of violent offenses. And there's a lot of science to it. So we've known this for 20 years, and yet it doesn't stop the politicians from being tough on crime. Tough, and stupid.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost one of these things like, I don't know, like the FBI or the CIA or something where you, or the military, where you want people that aren't worried about getting elected and staying elected to be there for a whole career, to spend so that you don't get caught up in the rhetoric of politics.
Well, good point. And in fact, when you consider then the idea that the justice system is a bunch of moving parts,
right,
smaller subsystems, if you will, then you have chiefs of police, and you have heads of prison systems and heads of parole system,
right,
et cetera, sheriffs, et cetera, some of which are elected officials. Sheriffs are usually elected. Judges are elected. And so the connection, tied at the hip, if you will, between the political system and the justice system puts it in harm's way. But at the same time, there are career professionals, people that come up through the ranks of law enforcement who end up being chiefs of police, who are not elected, but who are appointed by politicians and can live and die by those kind of appointments. But you often see remarkable men and women who are running police departments, and remarkable people that are running corrections departments, and they can become, and often are, a voice of reason to press up against and counterbalance some of the more political rhetoric. However,
it's the people that are setting your budget are the elected legislators. So
there's that, but let me offer that's more a secondary, even a third level consideration. The first level consideration is that those people that are career professionals are usually not involved in the campaigns. And when politicians are running for office is when they make their promises.
Right.
And then once they make their promises, the stupid shit that they say while they're running for office about being tough on crime, and they want people to be in prison longer, when there's very little correlation between the length of imprisonment and reduction of criminal activity. I mean, who's going to argue that doing 7 years in a prison system is much more effective than doing 5 years in a prison system, other than the fact that people will argue, well, that 2 years that individual is locked up and not committing crime is worth it. Well, what does that cost? And really, if it's $45 a day or $50 a day to keep somebody locked up in prison, you multiply that by 365 days, and then multiply that by 2 or 3 years. Look at that cost per person, multiply that by 100 people, get that large dollar figure, and then weigh that, spending the money that way, as opposed to spending it for better law enforcement, better investigative capabilities, better efforts to identify juveniles at a younger age before they graduate, if you will, into the adult system. And you'll see time and time again that the research is very clear. Money spent is better spent in earlier prevention, and yet you're back to this cycle of politicians making promises. So then the politician says, okay, I've been elected, and you can look at the president of the United States who said, holy shit, I've been elected president.
Right.
Now what do I do? He never expected to win, I'm sure of that.
Sure.
And whether you expect to win or not, when you're running a campaign, particularly for a statewide office like governor, I've been involved in governor campaigns. They don't spend very much time being prepared to actually run the government. In fact, they may be very good politicians, but perhaps not very good managers.
Right.
When you've got
it's a different set of skills to get elected than to govern.
And their ability to delegate and to
which is a real shame about the whole democratic system, is that oftentimes there's not a lot of overlap between the governing versus the getting elected skill set.
And we do take time in the states to dig deeper into their policy positions and what they'll do. There's always, interviews and debates and lots of media coverage that gets into the detail. But there's that, but more than that, which drives elections, is negative campaigning, which is amazingly effective, and then the kind of the tough campaigning, which is also effective. And so it's certainly out of balance.
Right.
And politicians do not spend their money developing deep issue briefs on how they're going to run the Department of Corrections or the Department of Commerce. They spend their money on attack ads, which, in spite of how many of them say, God, I hate that.
Right.
Anybody who they hire is going to say, well, yeah, sorry, but you better do it. And the story of John McCain, who I consider an American hero and a maverick politician in his own right. He too ended up succumbing to the need for negative politics, and he hated it. And there's a lot of stories about that. So it's you can't separate the so-called justice system from the political world, and it's one of the reasons that it is so incredibly ineffective and so incredibly costly. And it's where I spend a lot of my time trying to figure that out with people.
Would it help if we educated? I mean, would it help if we educated the population to what the best methods are? So, I mean, I guess that's sort of the liberal dream of the educated voter making sound decisions. Whereas all you really need is a candidate to use the fear and crime card, and we go back to our, like, it's easy to scare people with for example, Trump's Mexican rapist narrative.
Sure, and frankly, again, there's actually plenty of that going on. Right. And you have, like, the League of Women Voters, and you have, in the criminal justice field, you have criminal justice associations of district attorneys and public defenders and judicial associations, and you have advocate associations, and you have families of prisoners and formerly incarcerated persons associations. And they spend a good deal of time doing that and educating the voter. But at the end of the day, the people that can advise campaigns will say, well, that's good, and do that, sure, and spend a dime of every dollar on that, and then spend 90% scaring the hell out of people, because at the end of the day,
that's what
the uneducated voter who you're trying to get to come to the poll and vote is not going to be swayed by so much the thoughtful stuff, but is going to be swayed by saying, I'm scared of what's happening, I need to get off my ass and go vote.
Right.
When you consider the incredible number of people in this country that don't vote, particularly young people who are, depending on the characteristics that you're looking in your data, are educated and more susceptible to education of the issues. How to get them motivated is driven to a large extent, by leadership that motivates them. That's why Bernie Sanders, for example, was very, very successful. A little bit too late, in the 2016 election to actually win the nomination. And I think he was running initially and said, "Holy cow! I'm not just running to bring in my far left socialist message here. I'm actually gaining enough popularity I could win." By the time he realized that, it was almost too late. But he attracted people who, and now in this 2020 election cycle, continues to attract people who are younger, more thoughtful, more educated, and who will contribute small amounts of money. Famously, recently, average of $27, per person. He raised more money in 24 hours, I think, than any politician has. I won't quote your number, but I think it's $6 million in his first 24 hours. That is exciting because he is more of an intellectual politician, very thoughtful, and he and others who are running will help bring the entire field more in that direction. But that's not that may not be enough to overcome some of these other more provocative, if not productive, approaches to just scare the hell out of people.
Yeah, it seems kind of fundamentally broken, but I guess are there? I suppose there are places, either different states or different nations, that do things better than others, and it's sort of like a landscape where we can see that it some points are higher than others, and we want to try and move towards, even though you're never going to get zero crime perfection, but there's just so many variables that it seems
Yeah,
like a
well, and
complicated thing.
there's a lot of pretty well funded national efforts to try to move the needle
Right.
toward a smart, more research driven approaches. We've got a lot of private foundations in the country that are helping fund that. The Arnold Foundation, based out of New York City and Texas, is one of the bigger ones. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars over years to try to improve the decision making and the tools that people have in the justice system. I was part of a national project called the National Criminal Justice Reform Project, funded by the Arnold Foundation, that worked in 5 states, each of which determined what part of the justice system or parts of the justice system they wanted to improve. And then this funding provided technical assistance, including me and others like Roger Shabilsky, a fellow that I work with, who's a criminal justice implementation scientist, which is
Wow,
quite a
that's a cool
quite a
title.
term, getting people to understand what really works. And you do that to kind of overcome what the politicians have done and said. Another project I was involved in that was funded by the Public Welfare Foundation out of Washington, D.C., that was very interesting, was that we became engaged with the political system to work with candidates for governor who, I think the general rule was they had to be in single point digits projected to win,
Right.
and talk with them and work with their campaigns to say stuff that was smart on crime, tough but smart, so that they didn't box themselves into the dumb stuff, but instead kind of box themselves into the smart stuff, and then able to fulfill those promises. We provided more technical assistance and deeper education and technical assistance to be able to get them to follow through. Now that's like a very small effort. We ended up working with only several governors and had mixed results. But you see national, like the Sentencing Project out of Washington, D.C., which is a great one. We can show that up on the screen for folks, or give them the information about that. But we recently, I worked with Mark Maurer, who's the head of that, who's written some incredible books on the injustice of racial disparity in the justice system. And we just published a manuscript on looking at 5 states that have managed to reduce their prison population by double digits and have maintained that double-digit reduction over some period of time. And what we see there is, in fact, multifaceted efforts kind of across the board to take that approach, except in one state, Michigan, where they took more of a single approach, which was to improve prisoner reentry, which is where I do most of my work. And that had a dramatic impact on the reduction of the number of prisons and the cost of prisons and the length of time in prisons, et cetera, all more evidence-based. So there's a lot of stuff going on that moves the needle. But it's a small effort when you compare the hundreds of millions, the billions of dollars that are spent going in the other direction,
Right.
with negative campaigning.
So in the U.S., the to use the term that you said isn't really true, the criminal justice system is controlled at the state level almost entirely. There are federal crimes and federal prisons and things, but like the sort of stuff that we're talking about is managed at the state level. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. And
is
not to underscore or not to underestimate on the local level too. So you've got local justice systems,
Right.
police and courts, and probation and parole, state agencies generally, but oftentimes they're actually could be run locally, but local and state is where most of the action is. Yeah.
And who has the most power over stuff like that? Is it the state governors or state legislators?
State governors have tremendous amount of power, and particularly in the executive, controlling so much of the system. I mean, if you're going to look at, as I mentioned earlier, upwards of 60% of the tax dollars that local citizens pay is going to be for a mixture of state and local justice and corrections and law enforcement components. And when you look at those that are most costly, you're looking at prisons. And it may be like in Michigan, for example. I don't know what the overall cost of the systems are. We could figure that. But the prison system and the probation parole systems here cost over $2 billion a year the governor controls that, the legislature controls the purse, and that's where politics comes into play. I would say that governors are less susceptible to politics only during about 4 years of a typical 8-year term.
Right.
They're able to be smart on crime. If they're smart on crime when they run, they're able to be smarter on crime the first 2 years they're in office before they start running again.
Right.
And then if they win again, they're smart for another 2 years before they become lame ducks. And
Right.
so you've got to understand when you're doing criminal justice reform, these political cycles, and the best window is to get in the door with somebody who's been governing. You want to get in the door if you can while they're running.
Right. Take
But
as
if
many
you
steps
can't-
forward as you can before you start backsliding.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of ways to have that impact, and the power of the purse is huge. I mean, there was a foundation based out of New York City called the JET Foundation, JEHT, Justice, Equity, Humane Treatment, I think was their acronym. And they, very wealthy family who made their money in Manhattan and in I think more in hotel and land and God only knows what. They had a lot of money. And they were committed to improving the justice system, remarkable dedication of purpose. And in Michigan, they were very, very closely responsible for the reforms that we did here because they put millions of dollars into it, and it helped the governor who wanted to do the reforms be able to do those reforms in a way which was cost effective because she had to spend less state money to do it. And they basically provided the seed money that created the capabilities that we needed to reduce the size of the prison population. And then once we started saving the money, we could invest some of the savings into doing greater reforms. And it was a remarkable private-public partnership.
Nice.
Bernie Madoff was their financial advisor. And when Bernie made off with their money, they lost, don't quote me, but I think well over $200 million.
Right.
And so the foundation closed. In fact, I got a call from the foundation after we had just received a check for, I think it was $1 million. And they said, "Did you cash that check?"
Please don't.
Please don't. And, because this is what's happened. And it was, it was a nightmare, more for them than for us. But later, I met the young couple who were anonymous all through the time that we were using their money. And we took them into a prison system where the reforms that they had paid for and helped support were in place.
Nice.
And we had a remarkable exchange with them. It was very emotional and moving because they could see
Right.
the results of what they had done. And they talked with prisoners who were there who were talking about their appreciation of what we were doing to help improve their individual chances for success post-release. And that's how you reduce crime rates in a large scale, is that you do better individual planning, and you do that 100 times, 1,000 times, and you will have a positive impact on crime if you do that. We proved that in Michigan, a place that did more, a little bit less across the board approaches, scattershot approaches, and more dedicated to one thing. So there's a lot to unpack there too.
Yeah. So, I mean, this, my mind is seeing similarities with like climate change, for example, where we've got really solid science, but politics is capable of just totally ignoring the science and doing the wrong thing. So, like, you would think that if you have a proven methodology to reduce crime, that you could just cookie cutter that around everywhere, and and we'd all, the tide would raise all our ships. But apparently, it's harder to do that. Or do people in all the states read the literature and understand that those things are better, and are just unable to convince the people in charge to do that? Or what's...
Well, so my experience, I've worked in 12, 14 states and examined these issues, and what you see everywhere is some real successes and some really thoughtful approaches. They may be urban-based, city-based. Mayors have a big hand in this. We've seen some remarkable things happen out of a lot of major cities. If you want to examine, a city that has been addressing justice issues in some unique ways over a long history, Chicago, Illinois, in a state where, like many states, the people that are in the prison system are largely those that are committing crimes or living in urban centers.
Right.
That's the case across the board. Crime and justice issues are largely urban-based. And in Illinois, back in the day, it's not so much the case now. Upwards of 60, 70% of everybody who is in prison came from and returned back to Chicago. So if you wanted to resolve state level issues, you better resolve what's happening in Chicago. Same in Michigan, to a lesser extent, Detroit,
Right.
where when I was working in the Department of Corrections here, about 44% of everybody who's in prison returned to the city of Detroit. So if you want to help resolve state issues, you got to work with urban centers. And so you see a lot of approaches in a lot of different places. So one jurisdiction may be doing some great stuff on bail reform. Others may be doing stuff on services within jail, pretrial services. Others may be doing reforms on sentencing and working with the judiciary in creative ways. Others working with creative probation or parole programs, other prison systems doing things. The challenge is that they're doing small things, and it's very difficult to spread those and to make them larger.
Right.
And that makes the justice system, like any system. I've looked at corollaries, again, with the educational system and the justice system, where you can go into a classroom that has, received some funding to do some special work with students in a special way. It's remarkable what they've been able to achieve, and the cost per student is, several $1,000s. Well, when you try to replicate that in a larger group, you start to fail because the replication is difficult, the amount of funding is difficult. And anytime you take a successful small program and try to make it larger,
some things don't scale well.
They don't scale well, and there's a couple of things to consider. One is, expanding them in other jurisdictions, and perhaps doing it in a pilot or demonstration way.
Right.
But then there's taking it up to scale, meaning, so we were able to replicate it from one urban center to another urban center, and we're very successful with the first 50 or 100 people that we served, but we really have thousands of people, and then you have to take it up to scale. That requires a tremendous amount of money, leadership, long-term support, and government support is often not long-term. You get federal support, it's 2 or 3 years. You get philanthropy support, foundations, they don't fund you forever. You've got to make remarkable system changes and put those changes into statute. And if you put them into statute, guess who's involved?
Right.
Politicians who talked about being tough on crime, and that's where you get into difficulty.
Well, it also seems like it might be one reason that it might be hard to scale a small thing up to a bigger audience is it might be hard to find the actual causal thing that is making the small program work. Like maybe the person in charge is just extremely charismatic or empathetic or whatever, and that person can write down all of the procedures that they're doing, and you can give it to another person and they can try and repeat exactly what they've done. But if they aren't giving off that, undescribable social vibe that is hard to replicate, then it's not going to work in the next setting. So to really prove that something works, you've got to replicate it a whole bunch of times, I would imagine.
Well, and in fact, the research proves exactly what you've said, that when you have a program that is run largely through the charisma, if you will, of a leader who is able to draw the money and draw the administrative and operations staff that are dedicated and to the person, that those programs that are successful have a much harder time to be replicated. And in fact, there's some would conclude that having programs that have that characteristic of being led by a charismatic leader is not the way to go. But more to the point is you have to be then particularly careful about replication. And it is, in fact, about exactly what you've said, writing it down, policies, procedure, protocols, who does what when. And then when you replicate it, following that, in the work that I do, I talk about, the difficulty of implementation and use the analogy of a stream that starts at a spring at the top of a mountain. And if implementation is the gravity-induced downward movement of that stream, the stream doesn't go straight down a mountain. It hits barriers along the way, and if those barriers, like a bunch of logs and stones in a particular path, the water will pool, and then at some point the water will either flow over the top, it'll break through the log jam, or it'll go around it. Implementation is like that. You can have pretty significant barriers, and you have to decide, what do I have to do to keep continuing, down the path, if you will, of success. And if you change the model significantly to overcome that barrier, you can eliminate the cause and effect that was there.
Right.
Also, to that point, just to add, is that when you're doing broad-based system change, using Michigan as an example again, there were 50 things we were doing differently to try to improve the post-prison reentry system.
Right.
And researchers said, well, which of these 50 things is responsible? Well,
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It isn't just one thing; it's the interaction of thing. And
it's not ethical to say, all right, we're going to keep everything constant and only try and do one thing, because if you could be doing 50 things, you sort of want to, but that's not like the social sciences has that problem with proving things scientifically, is that you can't. It's not ethical to only attempt one thing at a time and see if it works, because
and these approaches, these one things at a time that they do, are not often started with the end game in mind, with some input in terms of what a process or impact evaluation would look like. And so instead you end up with leadership, perhaps charismatic, perhaps less so. I talk about the different types of leadership you need to be successful, particularly at the state level. You need that charismatic political leadership from a governor, but you also need administrative leadership from the Department of Corrections, high level, at the director or secretary level. And then you need operational leadership and people that are smart and can, write it all down. They're going to do a bunch of different things. Research may come in later and say, wow, you've had some successes. Now let's measure which of them had a greater impact. And they try to break it down. And, I remember having a conversation saying, frankly, you got to understand this, working with some research department. I think it was the University of Michigan. And I said to them, I frankly, I got to be clear. I don't care. I don't care to know and to take the time and the money to figure out which of these, because we're reducing the number of people that are failing coming back to prison by 36%. I'm not going to, try to tear that apart. It's very difficult to evaluate system change.
Sure.
Much researchers say, well, what program was it? Was it the apprenticeship program? Was it the family reunification program? Was it the fathers of incarcerated, the children of incarcerated fathers program? Yeah, and it's like, well, no, I don't know. It's like all of those things, and it's working. So it's your job to try to unravel that and figure that out. It becomes very complicated.
Sure.
And then it can end as quickly as it starts. You lose that political, gubernatorial, charismatic, if you will, leadership when there's an election change.
Right.
Happens all the time. New governor comes in, a program that has been successful is associated with the former governor. That former governor is from a different political party. New broom sweeps clean. We're going to end this soft on crime thing, and the data be damned. We had a change of leadership here from Democratic Party, Jennifer Granholm, to Republican Party, and new governor came in, a businessman, and he was very clear that the data was good and therefore don't change it. And there was a bit of a flap about that when they hired a new corrections director, and the new corrections director was a sheriff, tough guy, and at his first press conference here, started talking trash about the reentry program, and the rumor was the governor pulled him aside and said, "Look, I'm a metrics and measures guy. Don't say that. This thing is working.
Nice.
Be careful." And but then he killed it over time. Death by 1,000 wounds.
Right.
And so slowly but surely, one of the primary ingredients of effective prisoner reentry reform is full community ownership and engagement at the local level. So the state is a partner with the communities from where prisoners came and to where they're returning, and that is not common. The state departments of correction want to run it, and they're in control of it. And so when you're running a Department of Corrections, you may say, wow, this is messy, having all this input at the local level, and slowly but surely that deteriorates. They start getting less authority on how to spend the money, and that's where most of the change and most of the impact is going to happen post-release. And so there's a whole dynamic there that I could talk for hours about, but it's the way that, once again, the political system, be that big P politics and people running for office change it, or small P politics where you've got the politics of a corrections secretary or a corrections director who's a former elected official, a sheriff. He is being pushed by sheriff's associations who tend to be, of course, on the law enforcement spectrum, tougher than, for example, a public defenders association.
Right.
And they are beholden. And, and it's all about money, a large of it, a good part of it. How do the sheriffs get more funding to do what they want to do? And is that stuff more effective than what we're trying to do over here? It's complicated. I may have mentioned to you that the whole improvement of a justice system is sort of like trying to capture Jell-O with chicken wire. And there's a fellow in Michigan who did our prison population projections. His name was Jeff Anderson, and that's an analogy he used to explain at a legislative hearing and to the director of corrections how difficult it was to try to predict how large of a prison population we'd have in future years, because you squeeze the chicken wire in one part and the jello squeezed out in another part, and it's all very interactive. And that's a great analogy for the justice system as a whole. And so this report that we put out in the Sensing Project, 5 states that reduced incarceration in their prison populations, looked at those multiple facets and what they did to try to control, the chicken wire impact, if you will. And a lot of it, gets down to what I'm saying about political, administrative, charismatic, operational leadership.
Wow, yeah. We've got lots of different paths we can take here. So, name one particular program. I mean, this is what you said you didn't want to do before, but is there any program that you're positive could be done anywhere and would reduce crime?
Sure, and it's clear, and there's pockets of this all over the country. There's good evidence, and it has to do with preparing prisoners for employment, and then working with the business community for employment that understands a couple of dynamics that the research shows. Number one, that whatever you do to improve prisoner outcomes, you need to start it when they're in prison, but you need to continue it and do most of it post-release. So a general ratio that I use that the research supports is that if you've got 100% of something of a program that you want to do about 30% of it inside and then 70% of it outside. And I can point to different places that are doing a good job inside, but a poor job outside, or a poor job inside, a better job outside. But when you pull that together in a more cohesive approach, and you focus on what the research says is that while they're in prison, teach them the soft skills of what it means to be a good employee. And if you're going to teach the hard skills, technical skills that particular employers need, only teach those skills at the request of and at the guidance of those businesses that are committed to hiring. So if you're going to train in welding pre-release while they're still in prison, make sure that the way that you're teaching welding is the way that the people that are going to hire welders want it done, because there's not just one way to weld.
Right.
Different equipment is used, different skills, different approaches, et cetera. And that's true with everything. So there are elements of effective pre-employment, employability, employment programs that, when you put it all together, can be very successful. We're working on a project in Louisiana, southeast Louisiana, in Jefferson, St. Tammany, and Orleans Parish, called Ready for Work. And that is business-driven. We have an advisory council made up of business people. We're looking at all the research. We're creating a program design where the businesses that are interested in hiring people will drive the way that we do pre-release, pre-employability, and employment. And it's a very good program approach. And it's still in the design stage, which takes a long time to be able to design it, but we're very hopeful about it. And we're drawing from research that we've seen in effective programs that have done some of the components well, all of the components well, in a small scale.
Right.
And then trying to replicate that, see how that works in, 1, 2, then 3 parishes, and working in a community where you've got an incredibly high proportion of the population, the free world population, have been in prison or been in justice involved. And there's studies that show the remarkable data that what you have to overcome. So in some neighborhoods, you may see that 50% or more of everybody who lives in a neighborhood has been involved in the justice system, perhaps even with a felony conviction record.
Right.
And because of that felony conviction record, very hard to find a job, very hard to find housing. And when you think about then, here we go again with the chicken wire thing, right? Is that you can't just focus on jobs. You also have to focus on housing, and you can't just focus on housing and jobs. You also got to attend the fact that a lot of these guys that are returning to prison again and again, those that are highest risk of recidivating, moderate to high risk of recidivating, they also have co-occurring mental health and substance abuse issues.
Right. You've
got to address that. You've got to take a holistic approach. Well, what's more important, a job or housing? Well, the answer is they're both important.
So
and you've got to. So it's difficult.
I have a question. What sort of time frame do you need to look at? Once you decide, all right, we're gonna implement this idea. how long does it take before you can feel confident in whether or not that worked or not? Because it's got to be several years, right?
Oh, it's years. It's years. But it gets down to a lot of interrelated things. Now, we've already talked about charismatic leadership, administrative leadership, operational leadership. Let's say you have those. And let's say as a result of having those, you have funding. And as a result of that funding, you can do a pretty good plan, right? So looking at the Ready for Work project as an example in southeastern Louisiana, you have the support of the United Way of Southeast Louisiana. Michael Williamson, the director of that agency, is just very charismatic and leading this thing from a philanthropic standpoint. You've got good leadership there with, more or less good competency in the Department of Corrections, depending on, where you're looking. But you've got some of the right ingredients there. You've got good leadership in the business community, but you don't have that much funding, so it's going to take longer to plan it. Mm-hmm. And then you plan it, and then you propose it, and let's say it's funded. Then when you fund it, you're going to work with small numbers. Now, if you want to study the impact on recidivism, meaning recidivism being another criminal conviction or a return to prison, it takes longer to be able to do that. There's a way to study the group of people that you're working with and compare them to a group in prior years. Mm-hmm. It's called a time to failure analysis, where you can say, you know what, it's not cause and effect, but this first group of 100 that we work with, they return to prison in the first year and a half, or first year, or even in the first several months, at a rate which is much smaller than a group that looked just like them from 5 years prior. Right. So we're in the right track, we're in the right direction, or we're not. If we're not, let's adjust the program and then try it again. And then you can compare a cohort or a group with another cohort, another group, and you constantly interact with your design. And you're always asking this question, what did we do as the water of implementation was running downhill, and we reached a particular barrier because we watered down, the approach, and that cost us some fidelity. Roger Shabilsky, who I work with, always talks about fidelity. Mm-hmm. His growing up, he had a stereo system that was high fidelity. Well, what did that mean? Right. That meant that when you're in the room listening to it, it sounded a lot more like it did if you were in the room where the orchestra, the band was playing. Right. Well, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to replicate with high fidelity, but it's very tough. So the short answer, which I'm incapable of providing, is that it takes many years. And when we're working in a state that wants to do long-term reform, we want them to really hunker down and understand this is a 5 and 10 year commitment. And you've got to do that at the workable moment, while you've got that cadre of charismatic administrative operational leadership, so that you can prove impact in a quick enough time frame and put that stuff that you're doing into writing, into policy and procedure, if not statute, so that you're better able to ameliorate the potential impact of politicians coming in and changing it. And so it's a longer term process, but if you get in a state at the right time, you've got that time. If you don't, then you don't, right. And it becomes more difficult.
Do you have experience attempting to implement something? And I mean, for sure, there have been failures where you don't see any change. But have you ever tried to implement something and then actually crime went up as a result of, compared to a control group that? Oh, sure. Yeah.
Oh, sure. And I just was telling this story the other day. In fact, it was funny. I told you the other day I had a laceration and I had to go to the hospital for emergency surgery, and I was numbed. My arm was numbed, and so I was able to talk. And one of the attendants in the operating room had a son who'd been involved in the justice system. We ended up talking about criminal justice reform, and he mentioned Scared Straight, which was a educational program for juveniles that was put into motion, and you would take these juveniles and you take them into a prison and right. you interact with hardened criminals, and the idea was you'd scare the hell out of them, right? Well, the study showed that had a negative impact, meaning that the kids that were involved ended up more likely to engage in criminal activity, and the researchers call it the Al Capone effect, where they would meet a guy and they were impressed with the tough guy right. kind of approach, and I want to be like that. Nice. And that didn't stop Scared Straight, because your gut would tell you, wow, that makes sense. And it's what we would call sexy. People understand it. They would do films, the documentaries, and it's like, no, don't do that. And the other, and I'll get into the weeds here a bit, but and Roger talks a lot about this implementation science, is that in order for these programs to be effective, you got to work with the right people that are most responsible for recidivating.
Right.
And those people are the ones that you really find more difficult to work with because they tend to be the non-compliant, non-responsive.
Right.
Oh, guess what? Antisocial behavior. Oh, guess what? Antisocial peers. Criminal thinking. Right? Those characteristics, which make it much more difficult. We'd much rather work with the guys that are easy to work with, who show up on time, are polite. And if you're a nonprofit program in the community, those are the people who are knocking on your door looking for services. And so you're working with the lower risk people, and you say, and they see this all the time, only 3% of the people we work with return to prison. Okay, well, when you do a control group, what percentage of them? And the answer could be 2%.
Yeah.
Why? Because when you pick a low risk person, you put them in a program where they got to jump through hoops. I got to do community service. I got to pass a urine test, a frequent urine test.
Yeah.
They fail to jump through those hoops. If you would have just left them alone, they wouldn't have had to do those things. And so you turn it on its head. And there is a paper that was written. I've got a dog-eared copy near me called the Unmet Promise of Alternatives to Incarceration, written by Kay Harris and Alan Harlan from Temple University in Philadelphia. Kay Harris just passed this past year at the ripe age of 80-something. She was my hero.
Wow.
Her and Alan just changed the trajectory of my career when I read this and followed them and then became colleagues of theirs. But it was about this. And so you can have a good design and work with the wrong person. And when you're a reformist or an advocate and you found your niche where you've got some funding for a program and you're working with a population, you've got good stats, you don't want to hear it. You also don't want to change it. So it's not just about the politicians, and it's not just about the state agencies.
Oh, yeah.
You have the same kind of politics in nonprofits where they're fighting for dollars, and maybe they've worked for 10, 15 years to create a sense of authority and accomplishment. And if you go and talk with them and say, well, it's great you're doing this good work, and if your goal is to help a lot of people, you met that goal. But if your goal is, as you say, to reduce the impact of crime in the community, you're actually not doing that great of a job with that. So do you want to learn evidence-based practices? And if you do, are you willing to do less with the people who are knocking on your door, who are more compliant, who are lower risk, and do more with the people who are less compliant or are higher risk? They're like, holy cow, my case managers don't want to do that. I mean, if you're a parole officer, who do you want in your caseload?
Right. Exactly.
And so these things work against it. And so it gets back to the idea, your question here of, do you see programs, what the research shows that it actually, hurts things? Mm-hmm. Yes, all the time. In fact, that's one of the reasons that, there's a national project called the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, JRI, very heavily funded by Pew Charitable Trust. And they've done some remarkable work in 24 or 25 states to change legislation that, changes, length of term for some, lengthens length of term for others, because they're creating, it's a political process. You've got to get the support of prosecutors and sheriffs. So you got to be tougher in some areas. But they think that success is that they pass laws. And that the laws, and that's not how you measure success. It's an implementation.
So how would you rate the breakdown of programs? Like, do most programs help, or do most hurt, or do most have no effect? Or
most have no effect or hurt.
Most have no effect or hurt. There's just a very few that actually is, and that's because of these biases that you were mentioning about picking the low fruit that wasn't going to be.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And it's a continuum, though. But and so the continuum would be, if you're a smaller program, that you have a higher chance of success if you're well designed, and you have those levels of leadership. But the more you move up the scale to larger scale programs, particularly when you see the adaptation of successful pilots or demonstrations trying to bring brought up to scale, you see a whole lot less success there. You imagine that if you have, a stream, from the spring at the top of the mountain, trying to get that stream to overcome those barriers is easier compared to a raging river, where it's dangerous to even get in those waters, right? This analogy, takes shape. And so it's a remarkable conundrum. It's some very exciting stuff, and I never want to, undersell or underestimate the power of the enormous number of great things that are going on in different pockets. But I can't overestimate the challenge of taking those small things and turning them into large-scale efforts. Our paper that I mentioned a couple of times does that to a certain extent from the Sensing Project.
All right, I've got one last question. How do you feel about felon voting laws?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge.
That's huge. That's really important that felons be able to vote.
Yes, it's very, 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 very important. And you talked earlier about to what degree do we need to educate the public in political sense, and you could take that and apply it just to the criminal justice system and look at the myths. And one of the facts is that when you punish someone by sending them to prison, whether you're doing that for specific deterrence or general deterrence, or you're doing it just on a retribution purposes, people continue to be punished. And a judge who I wish I remember who said this, he said, when you take a person, put them in prison, and you ship them off to a prison that's 10, 12 hours away from their home, and they're separated from their family, and you do that for years, you're giving them a life sentence,
right? Because
they will never overcome what's happened. So you get out of prison and you now have a felony record. Let's say you've been in prison a couple of times. You end up, tatted up. You don't look good. You haven't had a good record. You don't have, good assistance.
No relationships with people outside.
Right. So what do? You form associations and to overcome that. And so in Louisiana, there's a great organization called VOTE, the voice of it used to be called the voice of the ex-offender. Mm-hmm. They changed that acronym to the voice of the experienced. And it's led charismatic leader. And they focus on this, very heavily. I wouldn't say exclusively, but it's that power. And in Florida recently, they just changed the laws. You've got millions of people that are able to vote. In Michigan, we started an organization when I was a director of an organization called the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency, and we fostered an association within that organization called Nation Outside, developed and run by formerly incarcerated persons, or FIPS, the shorthand term, and our bylaws, et cetera, put control of the organization in the hands of people that have been in and out of the state prison system, and they're focusing on that as well. And know this, when you look at a state that has got not just, every year they have 10,000 people released from prison over the course of 10 years, then that's 100,000 people. And you look at their impact on their families, and let's say every person of the 100,000 over 10 years that has got, 2 or 3 family members, and you got 300,000. Well, look at the difference in the victor and the loser in a gubernatorial race. Right. It's 1%. Yeah. It's 2%. It's 3%. The power of this is that those folks, if they're well organized, have the power to change the outcome of an election. It's one of the reasons it scares the bejesus out of Republicans, because the research will tell you that most of the people that are in or out of prison are Democrats. The Republicans will tell you, well, that makes sense because most of the Democrats are crooks, right? But it's actually more on the scale of, liberalism and social assistance, where you've got people that are in the political spectrum are more geared toward helping on the social end of things, and that tends to be more liberal folks, and that's why they vote for that. And it's going to change the trajectory with the new political wave of activism in the liberal side of things on the left in the United States right now, and we can thank Donald Trump for that. And I don't thank him very much, and I don't thank him about much of anything. But he is, in fact, the reason that we're seeing a resurgence unlike anything we've ever seen in this country to get more voters involved. And many of the people are disenfranchised, and those folks are more on the lower end of the economic scale, which means that they very well may be persons of color, brown and black people who, because of both their economic disparity in the justice system and the racial disparity in the justice system, those are the ones that are most akin to what's happening. So it's no surprise that you see now a real effort at the national level here to pay attention to some justice reform. And Jared Kushner, no stranger, to the justice system, since his father was in prison at the hands of prosecutor Chris Christie, right? And he himself, may end up, having some very individual experience in the prison system. Who knows? He has done a good job of, focusing on some reform, and so the voting of disenfranchised persons, not just the former prisoners, but their families, who also have a tendency not to vote as well, and then take in the people who are, the millennials, who would be more prone to be sympathetic to this
Right.
and more prone to understand the economics of it. You bring them into the mix, and we are possibly moving toward a new era of ending the era of mass incarceration, which is the whole subject of another talk.
Well, that's a positive note to end on, I think.
Well, it's hard to be upbeat about the ineffective justice system, but yeah, it's a good note to end on. Well, it's been great talking to you.
Thank you for listening. The show notes for this episode, as well as all of our episodes, can be found on our website, seekjustice.fm. If you enjoyed what you just heard, please help us by telling a friend, sharing us on social media, or giving us a positive review in iTunes. That really helps others discover the show. If you'd like to get in contact with us to suggest topics you'd like us to cover, we can be reached on Twitter at SeekJusticeFM or by email to seekjusticefm@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.